Would rather. B2 Grammar Lesson. What does would rather mean? In English, would rather means would prefer. It is a phrase used to express a choice or preference between two or more options. Native speakers often use the contraction rather, for example, I'd rather. Would rather is used to indicate what one wants or prefers to do, have, etc. The phrase would rather is a modal auxiliary verb used to express a preference between two or more options. It functions similarly to prefer, but it is more commonly used in spoken and informal written English. I would rather eat fish tonight. In this sentence, would rather means would prefer. You could also say I would prefer to eat fish today. Examples of would rather. Examples: I'd rather not have any mushrooms, thanks. I'd rather get a taxi than wait for the bus. Would you rather eat now or later? I'd rather watch a film with subtitles than one dubbed into English. She would rather drive than take the train. I would rather you didn't tell them. If you'd rather, we can go outside. No, thanks, I'd rather not. Which beach would you rather go to? The use of would rather in English. We use would rather or rather to talk about preferring one thing to another. Would rather has two different constructions. The subjects are underlined in the examples. Same subject, plus base form. I'd rather stay at home than go out tonight. I'd rather not go out tonight. Different subject, plus past simple clause. I'd rather you stayed at home tonight. I'd rather you didn't go out tonight. The use of would rather in English. In negative sentences with a different subject, the negative comes on the clause that follows, not on would rather. She'd rather you didn't phone after 10 o'clock. Not. She wouldn't rather you phoned after 10 o'clock. Same subject. When the subject is the same person in both clauses, we use would rather, not, followed by the base form of the verb. We'd rather go on Monday. Not. We'd rather to go, or we'd rather going. More than half the people questioned would rather have a shorter summer break and more holidays at other times. I'd rather not fly. I hate planes. Same subject. When we want to refer to the past, we use would rather, plus have, plus ed form, perfect infinitive without to. She would rather have spent the money on a holiday. The money wasn't spent on a holiday. I'd rather have seen it at the cinema than on DVD. I saw the film on DVD. Examples: same subject and different subject. Same subject, plus base form. I'd rather stay at home than go out tonight. Different subject, plus past simple clause. I'd rather you stayed at home tonight. Same subject, plus base form. I'd rather not go out tonight. Different subject, plus past simple clause. I'd rather you didn't go out tonight. Examples: same subject and different subject. In negative sentences with a different subject, the negative comes on the clause that follows, not on would rather. She'd rather you didn't phone after 10 o'clock. Not, she wouldn't rather you phoned after 10 o'clock. Examples of different subject. When the subjects of the two clauses are different, we often use the past simple to talk about the present or future, and the past perfect to talk about the past. I would rather they did something about it instead of just talking about it. Past simple to talk about the present or future. Would you rather I wasn't honest with you? Past simple to talk about the present or future. Not, would you rather I'm not honest with you? Or, I won't be honest with you. I'd rather you hadn't rung me at work. Past perfect to talk about the past. Much rather. We can use much with would rather to make the preference stronger. In speaking, we stress much. I'd much rather make a phone call than send an email. She'd much rather they didn't know about what had happened. How to use would rather. 1. Same subject, you do both actions. When the person preferring the action is the same person doing it, use would rather followed by a base verb. If comparing two things, use than. Example: I would rather stay home tonight than go to the cinema. Example: I'd rather drink coffee. How to use would rather. 2. Different subject, you want someone else to do something. When the subject of the preference is different from the person who will actually perform the action, the second verb is put into the past simple tense, even though the meaning is present or future. Example: I would rather you stayed here. Meaning: I prefer that you stay here. Example: She would rather we didn't call. Meaning: I prefer that we do not call. Negation. To state what you do not want to do, use would rather not plus the base verb. Example: Do you want to join us? No thanks, I'd rather not. Structure of would rather. Subject, plus would rather, plus base verb, v1, plus than, plus base verb, v1, plus other elements. Examples: 1. I would rather have coffee than tea. I prefer coffee over tea. 2. He would rather stay home than go out. He prefers staying at home instead of going out. 3. My students would rather study at night than in the morning. They prefer studying at night instead of in the morning. Other structures of would rather. Remember, the structure of would rather depends on whether it refers to the same subject or a different subject in the sentence. Would rather, with the same subject. When the subject remains the same, the verb that follows is always in the base form, also called the bare infinitive, meaning it does not take to. Structure: same subject, plus base form. Subject, plus would rather, plus base verb, without to, plus other elements. I'd rather stay at home than go out tonight. I'd rather not go out tonight. Examples of would rather, with the same subject. 1. I would rather take the exam. I prefer taking the exam. 2. She would rather visit the mountains. She prefers visiting the mountains. 3. They would rather not waste time on social media. They prefer avoiding social media instead of wasting time on it. 4. He would rather read a novel. He prefers reading a novel. 5. We would rather stay indoors during the storm. We prefer staying indoors instead of going outside during the storm. 6. She would rather drink tea than coffee. She prefers drinking tea instead of coffee. 7. I would rather walk to work than take the bus. I prefer walking to work instead of taking the bus. 8. He would rather study alone than in a group. He prefers studying alone instead of studying in a group. 9. He would rather watch a movie than read a book. He prefers watching a movie instead of reading a book. 10. They would rather travel in summer than in winter. They prefer traveling in summer instead of winter. Would rather, with a different subject. Remember, when referring to another person's actions, we use the past simple after would rather, even though the meaning is present or future. Structure: different subject, plus past simple clause. Subject plus would rather plus subject plus past simple plus other elements. I'd rather you stayed at home tonight. I'd rather you didn't go out tonight. Examples of would rather, with a different subject. 1. I would rather you went home now. I prefer that you go home now. 2. My teacher would rather we practiced more. My teacher prefers that we practice more. 3. They would rather we spoke in English. They prefer that we speak in English. 4. He would rather she apologized first. He prefers that she apologizes first. 5. We would rather you didn't interrupt the meeting. We prefer that you do not interrupt the meeting. Would rather with the same subject, past preference. Remember, when we use would rather plus have plus past participle, we want to talk about our preferences in the past. Remember, this structure is used when we are talking about a past situation and wish that something different had happened. It often implies regret or a preference for an alternative past action. Structure. Subject, plus would rather, plus have, plus past participle. Examples of would rather with the same subject, past preference. 1. They would rather have stayed at home yesterday. They regret not staying at home. 2. He would rather have taken the earlier flight. He wishes he had taken the earlier flight instead of the later one. 3. We would rather have studied harder for the exam. We regret not studying harder. 4. She would rather have spoken the truth. She regrets not telling the truth. Would rather with a different subject, past preference. Remember, if we want to talk about the preference of another person's past action, we use would rather plus subject plus past perfect, had plus past participle. Structure. Subject, plus would rather, plus, that, plus another subject, plus past perfect. Examples of would rather with a different subject, past preference. 1. I would rather you had studied for the test. I preferred that you studied for the test, but you didn't. 2. He would rather they had invited him to the party. He wished they had invited him, but they didn't. 3. She would rather you hadn't spent so much money. She preferred that you didn't spend too much money, but you did. 4. We would rather she had arrived on time. We preferred that she arrived on time, but she was late. 5. They would rather we hadn't argued about it. They preferred that we didn't argue, but we did. The end. Thank you for watching.